So around 1000 BC, David becomes king of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. You go back into Genesis and you've got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's name changes and becomes Israel, and his 12 sons become the 12 tribes, more or less. Joseph's is split into two. It's a little more complicated, but in general, those are the patriarchs, and the tribes are named after them. So you have 12 unified tribes or families that comprise the nation of Israel. Saul is their first king, but David is the first king who's effective in the unified region that we call Israel or the people of God. David's son, Solomon, is who we've been reading about, becomes very powerful and builds the first temple. We've been reading about that, but apparently also builds the first temple and builds his own palace and makes all these improvements through slave labor, enslaving, I suppose, maybe people they had conquered in war, but apparently also his own people, taxing them heavily. So that even though Solomon achieved many great civic accomplishments, he was a bit of a tyrant. So when Solomon dies in 931 BC, his son Rehoboam is set to then become king. But Rehoboam is young. He's not wise like Solomon. And the people say, hey, we have had it with your father. Now that he's dead, you have got to let up on us. You can't continue to whip us literally and make us do all this work and tax us the way you have. You've got to let up. We need some mercy here. He goes to the elders who had counseled his father, and they tell him, listen to the people, let up on them. You've got to be their leader now. Have some pity, have some compassion. And politically, you don't want them getting angry at you now that you're suddenly king, because as far as they're concerned, they have no allegiance to you other than the fact that you simply happen to be the son of Solomon. But then his young buddies, his frat boy buddies, say to him, hey, hey, your father, you're as good as your old man was. You tell these people, you could be worse. You tell them your little finger is bigger than your father's whole body. That's another beer, would you? You tell them that. Don't you put up with their attitude. You're the king, and it's good to be the king. So, like an idiot, there's a lot of stupidity in history. And this is perhaps the clearest evidence of stupidity in all of the Old Testament. If Rehoboam had simply said to the people, now that I'm your king, I'm going to have some compassion on you. Let's see if we can continue to serve our God together. Things would have gone totally differently. But remember, God was angry at Solomon for worshiping all these false gods and having these hundreds and thousands of wives who were not worshiping the true God. So this is part of the consequence, we are told. On the political level, though, it's obvious that Rehoboam had a choice and he made the bad choice. Meanwhile, Jeroboam has come back. Now, Jeroboam, we read about in the last chapter. He was sent in exile into Egypt, but now he's back because Solomon is dead, and Jeroboam will figure more prominently in the chapters to come. And so, of course, it's going to be confusing because we have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And how on earth are you going to keep those two clear in your minds? Well, Rehoboam is Solomon's son, and that's who we're reading about today. So this is the split. From this point forward in the history of Israel in the Bible, Israel is no longer one nation or one gathering of people ruled by a king on earth, a single king. Israel, the 12 tribes split. The 10 tribes to the north eventually get Jeroboam as their king because they have rejected Rehoboam and the line of David. Rehoboam maintains control over the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, the two tribes in the south. So there's 10 tribes in the north. The north is sometimes called Israel, Sometimes it's called Samaria. Sometimes it's called Ephraim. So it goes by different names. But the focus of God's presence from this point forward in the Old Testament tends to be on the southern kingdom. Jerusalem remains its capital. Judah and Benjamin are its tribes. And the line of David continues, interestingly, because remember, God had promised David that he would always have a descendant to sit on the throne. The line of David continues uninterrupted until the Babylonians invade in 586 BC. So for another 300 plus 400 years, the line of David continues. It doesn't in the northern kingdom because they've rejected Solomon and Rehoboam. So until the Babylonian captivity, which we're reading about in Daniel, that takes place with the Jews who are living in Babylon because the Babylonians have taken over the southern kingdom. And earlier, a century earlier, 2 centuries earlier, plus the Assyrians had taken over the northern kingdom. And by this time, there really is no political entity that you can point to and say, this is Israel. By the time you get to the Babylonian captivity, all of the people of God are dispersed and living without a homeland. And although they kind of get one again, in a way, they never fully have one again because the Greeks invade and they're occupied by the Greeks, and then they're occupied by the Romans in the time of Christ. And then the second temple is destroyed. And until after World War II, there is no nation called Israel, and that it's set up again in, I think, 1948 as a political nation. But for all that time, thousands of years, it doesn't exist as a political entity, a clear political entity governing itself, I should say, because it does exist as a kind of political entity, but it has occupying forces and it's under the command of either Greeks or Romans or Babylonians or what have you. So this tearing apart of the kingdom, literally, you might say, although it's figurative, happens in 931 BC. That marks the division of the kingdom of Israel and of God's people, at least their existence as a political entity. So it's very important what we're reading today in 1 Kings. Your assignment, do a little extra research. Read a little about the split and about the history and about Rehoboam, Jeroboam, Solomon, and so forth. And tell me some more info about that. You can also ask questions, make comments about any of our other readings today, which are interesting, but I'm focusing in this video on 1 Kings because this is an important moment in the history of Israel. So do some more research and tell me a little bit more about what you learn, in addition to asking a question or making a comment in the dreaded Moodle.